You've been taught to measure military power all wrong. While analysts obsess over troop numbers and hardware inventories, France has quietly engineered something far more lethal, a force that defies every conventional metric of strength, yet projects power across three continents with surgical precision. This isn't some military mystery. It's strategic brilliance disguised as chaos. France maintains permanent bases in 7 African nations, deploys special forces across the Sahel, and intervenes in conflicts from Mali to Syria, all while operating what appears on paper to be a modest military apparatus. The illusion is intentional. What looks like inefficiency is actually optimization for a post-empire world where agility trumps mass, where diplomatic leverage matters more than division counts, and where nuclear deterrence buys you freedom to punch far above your weight class. This is about understanding power in the 21st century, not the power of occupation, but the power of indispensability. France's military makes 0 sense by Cold War standards, and that's precisely why it dominates the modern battlefield. The question isn't whether France's approach works. It demonstrably does. The question is what this tells us about the future of conflict itself. Let me start by telling you something that's going to sound absolutely counterintuitive, but stay with me because this is where the real story begins. France has roughly 205,000 active military personnel. To put that in perspective, that's smaller than Pakistan's army. It's dwarfed by India, China, and the United States. Turkey has a larger standing army than France, yet somehow this nation of 67 million people maintains a military footprint that stretches from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, from the South Pacific to the heart of Africa, and operates with a level of strategic autonomy that makes most NATO members look like junior partners in their own defense. This apparent contradiction isn't a bug in the system. It's the entire operating system, and understanding why reveals something profound about how power actually works in our contemporary world. You see, most people think about military effectiveness in terms of raw numbers. How many tanks? How many soldiers? How many fighter jets? It's a very 20th century way of thinking, rooted in the logic of total war where industrial capacity and mass mobilization determined outcomes. France looked at that paradigm and said, essentially, we're not playing that game anymore. They made a calculated decision coming out of the Cold War that they would never again try to match potential adversaries, unit for unit, division for division. Instead, they would build something entirely different. A military designed not for occupation or prolonged territorial defense, but for rapid intervention, for projecting just enough force at just the right moment to shape outcomes in their favor. This required completely rethinking what a modern military should look like. The foundation of this entire approach rests on one absolutely critical element that most analysts completely overlook when they're counting troops and tanks. France is one of only a handful of nations with a fully independent nuclear deterrent. This matters more than almost anything else in understanding French military strategy. Those 4 ballistic missile submarines patrolling the oceans, each carrying 16 missiles with thermonuclear warheads, provide something that money simply cannot buy: genuine strategic autonomy. France doesn't need permission from Washington or Brussels to make existential decisions about its security. That nuclear umbrella creates freedom of action that pervades every other aspect of their military planning. It means they can afford to keep their conventional forces relatively modest because the ultimate deterrent is always there, lurking beneath the waves. No one is going to invade France. No one is going to seriously threaten French territory. The nuclear arsenal makes that unthinkable. So what does that free them up to do? Everything else. And here's where it gets really interesting. With existential defense essentially solved by nuclear weapons, France built its conventional military almost exclusively for expeditionary operations. They're not designed to defend the Maginot Line or stop Soviet tank columns pouring through the Fulda Gap. They're designed to fly to Chad on 48 hours' notice and stabilize a collapsing government. They're designed to operate in the jungles of Central African Republic or the deserts of Mali or the mountains of Afghanistan with minimal logistical footprint and maximum operational flexibility. This is a military built for the wars that actually happen, not the wars that theorists imagine. And those wars, as we've seen repeatedly over the past 3 decades, are not mass industrial conflicts between peer competitors. They're asymmetric interventions in failing states, counterterrorism operations, evacuations of civilians from war zones, and what the French delicately call influence operations in their former colonial territories. Now, let's talk about Africa, because this is where French military strategy reveals its true genius and, depending on your perspective, its profound moral ambiguity. France maintains permanent military bases in Djibouti, Senegal, Gabon, Ivory Coast, and until very recently, Chad. They have defense agreements with multiple African nations that essentially guarantee French military intervention if those governments face existential threats. French special forces operate throughout the Sahel region, training local militaries, conducting counterterrorism operations, and gathering intelligence. On paper, this looks like the remnants of colonialism, and frankly, there's more than a grain of truth to that interpretation. But from a purely strategic standpoint, it's absolutely brilliant. These bases and agreements give France the ability to project military power throughout a resource-rich, strategically vital region while maintaining a relatively small force structure. They don't need massive standing armies because they have forward deployed capabilities that can respond rapidly to emerging crises. Consider what happened in Mali in 2013. Islamist militants seized control of the northern half of the country and were advancing on the capital, Bamako. The Malian government requested French assistance. Within days, not weeks, not months, but days, France had deployed 4,000 troops, helicopter gunships, and fighter aircraft. They stopped the militant advance, retook the major northern cities, and stabilized the situation before it could become a regional catastrophe. Could the United States have done something similar? Absolutely. But it would have required a massive bureaucratic process, congressional debates, coalition building, and enormous logistical effort. France just did it. They had the bases, the relationships, the expeditionary capability, and the political will to act unilaterally. That's what strategic autonomy looks like in practice. But here's what's really fascinating about the French approach. They've maintained significant domestic defense industry capacity even as their military has shrunk. They build their own fighter jets, the Rafale. They build their own tanks, the Leclerc. They build their own aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, helicopters, and small arms. This is extraordinarily expensive, and from a pure economic efficiency standpoint, arguably irrational. France could save billions by just buying American equipment off the shelf, but they don't, because maintaining domestic production capability serves multiple strategic purposes. First, it ensures they're never dependent on foreign suppliers for critical military technology. Second, it gives them something valuable to sell to other countries, which creates diplomatic leverage and relationships. Third, it sustains a high-tech industrial base that has spillover effects into civilian sectors. And fourth, it sends a signal about national ambition and autonomy that resonates both domestically and internationally. Let's zoom in on the Rafale fighter jet for a moment because it perfectly encapsulates this entire strategic philosophy. The Rafale is an excellent aircraft, versatile, combat-proven, genuinely multi-role. It's also much more expensive than just buying American F-16s or F-35s would be. France has exported Rafales to Egypt, Qatar, India, Indonesia, Greece, and Croatia, among others. Each of those sales came bundled with training programs, maintenance agreements, and deeper defense relationships. When Egypt bought Rafales, it wasn't just buying jets. It was buying into a relationship with France that includes intelligence sharing, joint training exercises, and political alignment on regional issues. This is military hardware as diplomatic currency, and France has mastered this game in ways that even larger powers often miss. The United States sells far more weapons globally, but American sales often come with political strings, congressional oversight, and unpredictable policy shifts. French sales are more discreet, more flexible, and often come with fewer awkward questions about human rights or democracy. Now, I want to address something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable but needs to be said plainly. France's military effectiveness is substantially enhanced by its willingness to operate in moral gray zones that Anglo-American powers increasingly struggle with. France has maintained relationships with some genuinely unsavory regimes in Africa and the Middle East, not because French policymakers are unaware of human rights concerns, but because they've made a calculated decision that strategic interests sometimes require tolerating imperfect partners. This isn't unique to France, of course. Every major power does this to some degree, but France does it with less hand-wringing and fewer public debates about whether supporting this or that government aligns with values and principles. There's a certain cold-blooded realism in French foreign policy that prioritizes outcomes over optics. When the government in Chad was threatened, France intervened to save it, not because Chad was democratic, it manifestly wasn't, but because a stable, French-friendly Chad served French interests in the Sahel region. This is 19th century great power politics dressed up in 21st century counterterrorism language. The French Foreign Legion deserves special attention here because it's such a perfect symbol of how France thinks differently about military power. This is a unit composed largely of foreign nationals serving under French command, offering a path to French citizenship after completing their service. It's simultaneously romantic and deeply pragmatic. The Legion allows France to recruit skilled personnel from around the world, including people with combat experience from other militaries. It provides a pool of soldiers who can be deployed to dangerous situations without the domestic political backlash that comes when French citizens come home in body bags. And it projects an image of France as this cosmopolitan, universalist republic that welcomes warriors from all nations into its ranks. The Legion has fought in virtually every French military operation of the past century, from Indochina to Algeria to Afghanistan to Mali. It's a small force, only about 9,000 legionnaires, but it punches far above its weight and gives France capabilities that no other Western military possesses. Let me pivot to something that might surprise you. France's military effectiveness is substantially enhanced by having much less robust veteran welfare systems than the United States. Now, before anyone gets upset, I'm not saying this is morally good. I'm saying it's strategically relevant. The United States spends enormous resources on veteran benefits, health care, disability payments, and long-term care for people who served in the military. This is the right thing to do, morally speaking, but it also means that every military operation carries massive long-term fiscal obligations. France doesn't have nearly the same level of veteran benefits, which means the true cost of military operations is substantially lower. A French soldier deployed to Mali doesn't generate the same decades-long financial tail that an American soldier deployed to Iraq does. This makes French politicians more willing to authorize military operations because the true costs are more contained. Again, I'm not defending this as policy. I'm explaining it as strategic reality. France has also been remarkably shrewd about maintaining relationships with its former colonies in ways that preserve French influence long after formal independence. The CFA franc, used by 14 African countries, is guaranteed by the French Treasury and effectively gives France significant influence over monetary policy in a huge swath of Africa. French is still the official language in dozens of countries, which creates cultural and educational ties that facilitate everything from intelligence gathering to business relationships to diplomatic negotiations. French television, French news agencies, French educational institutions, all of these create soft power networks that complement and amplify French military capabilities. When French troops deploy to Francophone Africa, they're not arriving as complete outsiders. They speak the language, they understand the culture, they have relationships with local elites. This familiarity dramatically enhances operational effectiveness in ways that are difficult for outsiders to replicate. Here's another aspect that's often overlooked. France has been much more willing than other Western powers to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. We're not talking about tens of thousands of casualties like World War I. We're talking about dozens or hundreds. But in an era when Western publics have become extraordinarily casualty averse, France has shown a higher tolerance for accepting losses when the mission demands it. French soldiers have died in Mali, in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, in Central African Republic. Each death is mourned, but it doesn't trigger the same kind of existential national debate about whether the mission is worth the cost. There's a certain stoicism in French military culture that accepts casualties as an inevitable cost of power projection. This psychological resilience is itself a strategic asset because it means French decision makers aren't paralyzed by the fear that a single ambush or helicopter crash will generate overwhelming pressure to withdraw. The maritime dimension of French military power is particularly fascinating and often underestimated. France has the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world, spanning over 10 million square kilometers across all the world's oceans. This is because France retained numerous overseas territories: French Guiana, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Réunion, Mayotte, French Polynesia, New Caledonia, and others. These aren't just tourist destinations. They're strategic outposts that give France legitimate territorial claims and military presence in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, the South Pacific, and South America. France can legitimately patrol and operate in these waters because they are French waters. This gives France a global maritime presence that most nations cannot match. The French Navy is relatively small, perhaps 40,000 personnel, but it operates across every major ocean. They have one aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, which is the only non-American nuclear-powered carrier in service. They have nuclear submarines, amphibious assault ships, and frigates scattered across the globe. This distributed presence means France can respond to crises in distant regions without needing to negotiate basing rights or overflight permissions the way most countries would. Intelligence capabilities are another critical element that's often invisible in standard military assessments. France has sophisticated signals intelligence networks, human intelligence operations, and satellite reconnaissance capabilities that are independent of American systems. The Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, DGSE, operates globally and has a reputation for effectiveness that rivals Mossad or MI6. French intelligence services have deep penetration in Francophone Africa, extensive networks in the Middle East, and growing capabilities in Asia. This intelligence infrastructure acts as a force multiplier for French military operations. When French forces intervened in Mali, they weren't operating blind. They had detailed intelligence on militant groups, their leaders, their supply lines, and their capabilities, gathered over years through both human sources and technical collection. Good intelligence can make a small force incredibly effective, and France has invested heavily in maintaining world-class intelligence capabilities, even as they've kept their conventional military relatively modest. There's also a cultural element to French military effectiveness that's worth examining. The French military tradition emphasizes initiative, decentralized command, and operational flexibility in ways that differ from more hierarchical military cultures. French military doctrine trusts junior officers and NCOs to make decisions based on local conditions rather than waiting for orders from higher headquarters. This creates a military that can adapt quickly to changing circumstances, which is absolutely critical in the kind of fluid, ambiguous conflicts that characterize modern interventions. When you're fighting non-state actors in complex terrain where the situation can change hour by hour, the ability to make rapid decisions at the tactical level becomes decisive. French military culture cultivates this kind of adaptability in ways that more bureaucratic militaries sometimes struggle with. Let's talk about something that's simultaneously impressive and deeply problematic: France's willingness to conduct what might politely be called regime stabilization operations that other Western powers would find politically untenable. Over the past 2 decades, French forces have intervened multiple times to prevent coups or support embattled governments in Africa. These interventions are rarely framed as such in public discourse. They're described as counterterrorism operations or humanitarian interventions or training missions. But the practical effect is that French military power has repeatedly been used to determine political outcomes in sovereign nations. This is neo-colonialism by another name, but it's also extraordinarily effective at preserving French influence. The governments that France props up tend to be friendly to French interests, grant favorable terms to French companies, and align with French positions in international forums. Is this morally defensible? That's an entirely separate question. Is it strategically effective? Absolutely. The economic dimension of French military strategy is also worth examining because it reveals how defense spending can be leveraged for broader national purposes. France spends roughly 40 billion euros annually on defense, about 2% of GDP. This isn't an enormous sum by global standards, but France extracts remarkable value from this spending because so much of it circulates through domestic industries. When France builds Rafale fighters or nuclear submarines or armored vehicles, that money employs French engineers, French workers, French researchers. It sustains high-tech industries that develop capabilities with both military and civilian applications. It creates export opportunities that generate revenue and diplomatic leverage. In contrast, when many countries buy American military equipment, that money leaves their economy and circulates through American defense contractors. France has deliberately maintained an integrated defense industrial base precisely to capture these economic spillover effects. It makes their defense spending simultaneously a security investment and an industrial policy tool. Here's something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. France has been remarkably successful at burden sharing within NATO while maintaining strategic autonomy. They participate in NATO operations when it serves their interests, but they're not bound by NATO consensus in the way smaller members are. France can operate outside NATO structures when necessary, as they did in Libya in 2011, initially conducting operations before NATO formally took over. They can coordinate with NATO forces or go it alone depending on circumstances. This flexibility is enormously valuable because it means France isn't constrained by the need to achieve consensus among 30-plus nations before acting. They can move quickly when speed matters, while still benefiting from alliance structures when broader support is useful. It's having your cake and eating it too, enjoying the benefits of alliance membership without surrendering autonomy. The French approach to military power ultimately reflects a sophisticated understanding of how influence works in the modern international system. It's not about controlling territory the way 19th century empires did. It's not about garrisoning troops in dozens of countries the way Cold War superpowers did. It's about maintaining sufficient capability to shape outcomes at critical moments in strategically important regions. It's about leveraging relationships, intelligence, rapid deployment capability, and political will to punch far above your weight class. France has roughly 1/12 the population of China and 1/5 the population of the United States, yet it operates as a global power with genuinely independent foreign policy and the military means to back that policy. That's remarkable when you stop and think about it. What France has created is essentially a boutique military, highly specialized, professionally excellent, globally deployable, but deliberately limited in scale. They're never going to invade and occupy Iraq. They're never going to fight a sustained conventional war against a peer competitor. But they can stabilize Mali. They can evacuate civilians from war zones. They can conduct airstrikes in Syria. They can patrol the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean and the South Pacific. They can maintain a nuclear deterrent that makes them essentially invulnerable to existential threats. And they can do all of this while spending a fraction of what the United States spends and fielding a military that's smaller than Turkey's. That's not a paradox. That's strategic clarity about what you're trying to achieve and building exactly the capabilities needed to achieve it, nothing more and nothing less.